Long, long, long ago, in a certain village, the beauty of a woman was measured by the length of her hair. The longer a woman's hair was, the more beautiful she was perceived by the people of the village. This made the women of the village to focus on grooming their hair as it gave them an edge when it came to marriage. A girl named Abike was born without hair. This was strange to her mother, who could not understand why her daughter had no hair. Abike's mother has tried several local treatments to see if Abike's hair would grow, but as the years went by, Abike's hair never grew. Abike's sisters had beautiful long hair, and Abike would stand in a corner admiring their lustrous flowing hair. Despite not having any hair, Abike was a very beautiful girl who was kind and compassionate towards others. She loved children so much and would spend most of her days with the village orphans who had no one to care for them. Abike would tell them legendary stories, and the children always looked forward to her visits. One hot afternoon, one of the orphans named Wumi, who was so concerned about Abike, asked her why she had no hair. Abike smiled and replied Wumi that she didn't have hair not because there was something wrong with her, but because she was born without hair. Abike then went on to tell Wumi that everyone is born different and that one should not be defined by his or her appearance but by the content of one's character. Wumi shone her eyes in amazement and went on to ask Abike if she had ever wished to have long hair like her sisters. Abike chuckled and replied Wumi saying, "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like, but I have learned that true beauty comes from the heart." Wumi was so inspired by Abike's wisdom as she realized that Abike was not only beautiful on the outside, but that she was compassionate and had a very beautiful soul. A few weeks later, the king of the village sent his guards to announce to the villagers that the prince was set to pick his bride. In the village, it is common knowledge that the prince of the village always picks the maiden with the longest hair to be his bride. The news of the prince's decision to pick a bride created panic amongst the maidens of the village, who all wished that their hair turned out to be the longest. Usually, before the prince's bride is announced, all the maidens would gather for the palace to ascertain who had the longest hair. What some maidens do at this time is to wrap their hair up so as to avoid being targeted by other maidens who are desperate to be the prince's bride. Many years ago, when the current king's father was set to choose his bride, a certain maiden realized that her sister's hair was longer than her own. One night, she cut her sister's hair, which caused a lot of commotion in the village, and since then, the maidens have been so careful, especially when the groom-to-be was the prince of the village. The king was yet to set the date when all the young maidens in the village will assemble for the palace to ascertain who truly had the longest hair amongst the maidens. Abike's sisters were extremely excited. They stood a great chance at becoming the prince's bride, so they became paranoid and decided to keep away from Abike. They believed that Abike might be jealous of them and end up cutting their hair. Abike noticed all this but paid no mind to her sisters. As days passed, the tension in the village began to heighten as all the maidens were now on guard. A certain girl named Bami was caught trying to cut her stepsister's hair, and this created an uproar as the maidens with extremely long hair began to lock themselves indoors to avoid being targeted. The news of this reached the king, who now sent his guards to announce that the prince will choose his bride a day after the next market day. Abike's sisters were all excited and began to prepare their clothing and accessories for the ceremony. When Abike walked into their room, one of her sisters then asked Abike if she would be attending the ceremony, and Abike replied, saying that the king had ordered that all the unmarried maidens of the village should assemble in the palace, and as a maiden, she would obey the king's orders by attending the ceremony. Her sisters laughed at her, and Abike felt very hurt by her sisters' laughter. She knew she had no hair and stood no chance of being picked, but she made up her mind to overcome her fears by appearing at the king's palace no matter what anyone thought about her. The day of the ceremony arrived, and all the beautiful maidens of the village gathered in front of the king's palace with their long and lustrous hair. Abike, despite being bald, walked into their midst, and all eyes turned towards her. The maidens all looked at her in shock, as they knew that she stood no chance at being picked by the prince. Some even laughed and called her names, making mocking statements underneath their breath. Abike paid no mind to them, as she stood her ground and waited for the prince to choose his bride. The prince then emerged, escorted by his guards. He walked around, looking at all the beautiful maidens, and he returned back into his chamber. After a few minutes, one of the prince's guards returned and addressed the maidens, saying that the prince had chosen his bride. All the maidens began to murmur as they wondered how the prince managed to choose a bride when their hair had not been measured to ascertain who had the longest hair. It was then that the guard announced that Abike was the prince's chosen bride. Everyone turned and looked at Abike in shock. They could not believe that the prince chose to marry a woman without hair. This was so strange and unusual, so all the maidens began to murmur and voice their displeasure. The prince could hear their murmuring from his chamber, so he emerged to address all the maidens present. The prince revealed that when he decided to choose his bride, he was told that the woman with the longest hair was believed to be the most beautiful in the village. This assertion was what the prince grew up to believe until recently, when he was told by a little orphan girl that one should not be defined by his or her appearance but by the content of one's character. What had happened was that the prince for so many years also visited the orphans and spent time with them. He loved children so much and always wanted to be around them. So a few days ago, when he went to visit the orphans, Wumi, the orphan girl, asked him how he planned on choosing his bride. The prince revealed to Wumi that he would choose the woman with the longest hair, as that was the measure of beauty in the village. Wumi then told the prince that a very beautiful woman once told her that a person should not be defined by his or her appearance, but by the content of his or her character. When the prince heard this, he asked who told Wumi such a wise saying, and Wumi revealed that it was a girl named Abike, who was the most beautiful girl she had ever come across. Wumi then revealed to the prince that Abike had no hair, but her heart was the most beautiful in the village. This caught the prince's attention as he decided to see such beauty for himself. The prince then decided to secretly spy on Abike. He followed her wherever she went and saw how she treated people kindly. The prince immediately fell in love with Abike and decided to marry her. He spoke to his father the king, who told him that the responsibility of choosing a bride rests on the prince solely, as the tradition of choosing a maiden with the longest hair began long ago by a king who loved two women and found it hard to choose. So he had to choose the one with the longest hair, and since then all the other kings followed in his footsteps, and it soon became a norm in the village. When the prince heard this, he made up his mind to marry Abike, who had the most beautiful heart. All the while, Abike never knew that she would one day marry the prince of the village. This came as a shock to her, as her story proved to the villagers that one should not be defined by his or her appearance, but by the content of one's character. That was how Abike became the wife of the prince of her village. Her sisters and everyone who mocked her in the past began to regret their actions and wished they never mocked Abike. The lesson to be learned from this story is that it is not good to discriminate against others because of their differences. Always remember that we are all born different and our unique traits are what makes us special. Be kind to others and learn not to judge people based on appearance, but focus more on the content of their character. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps us grow our channel. I'll see you in our next story. Bye.